Risk and risk management are common terms in the fields of security and related protection disciplines. We find them rooted in policy within dozens of Department of Defense instructions, directives, manuals, strategies, and glossaries. Among the different references, there are some nuanced variations between their uses of the term risk, but for all practical purposes, these definitions of risk are essentially the same. They all share an understanding that the concept of risk is comprised of three common elements: assets, threats, and vulnerabilities. Further, the definitions presume that there is a relationship between the three common elements that collectively determines or describes risk. Let's start by looking at each of the three elements. First, assets. Every protection discipline is tasked with protecting the resources on which commanders rely to execute their missions. Collectively, these resources are known as assets. Assets include, but are not necessarily limited to, people, equipment, facilities, and information. Naturally, the number of individual assets contained within an organization is tremendous. But for the purposes of evaluating risk, we generally limit the discussion to those which are considered critical. For an asset to be considered critical, envision what the loss of that asset would do to your organization's ability to execute its missions. If the work would go on unimpeded, then the asset is not critical. However, if its loss or compromise would degrade your organization's ability to execute its mission or otherwise make it less likely to succeed, then the asset is critical. Let's take it a step further. Recognize that each mission or organization will have numerous assets on which it depends, but it does not depend on all of them equally. The loss of some would have a grave, immediate, and long-lasting impact on the unit's capabilities, while the loss of others would be less severe. With this in mind, most risk assessment processes build upon the concept of criticality by accounting for the relative importance of each asset to the unit's mission in order to prioritize them. This prioritized level of criticality includes an understanding of how dramatically the loss of an asset impacts the mission, how quickly its loss would be felt, and for how long its loss would continue to have an impact. Okay, for example, if a unit's mission is to conduct river crossing operations, the bridging equipment would be a high mission impact because without that asset, the bridge cannot be constructed. Similarly, loss of the heavy equipment transport vehicles would degrade the unit's ability to quickly move the bridging material into place. However, the material could be moved by other less efficient means. So in this example, both assets are critical, but the bridging assets would be assigned a higher criticality than the vehicles that normally transport them. The same thought process applies when considering any critical asset, whether it be critical information, equipment, personnel, or anything else. Next, threats. The concept of risk presumes the existence of actions which potentially have a negative impact on assets. This population includes man-made actions, frequently called threats, and/or naturally occurring events, frequently called hazards. However, to best characterize threats and hazards, it's often useful to break them down into two components: threat methods and threat sources. Threat methods are the actual actions that impact the asset. Small arms fire is a threat method that impacts the asset of personnel. Open source intelligence gathering is a threat method that impacts critical information. And vehicle theft is a threat method that impacts vehicles. These three methods do evolve over time, however. The overarching categories are relatively static, even though techniques and tactics change. As an example, although the last decade showed considerable innovation in the methods of triggering roadside explosive devices, they all fit within the established category of improvised explosive devices. Threat sources. Threat sources are the persons, countries, groups, etc. that have the ability to execute a threat method. The population of threat sources can be dynamic, more so in some parts of the world than others. So, when evaluating a threat, we want to consider the combination of its source and method. Let's take two different examples. In the case of the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, a vehicle-borne improvised explosive device was the threat method, and Al-Qaeda was the threat source. Also, in 1992, Hurricane Andrew hit South Florida. In this case, the flooding and high winds that impacted critical DoD assets were the threat methods, and Hurricane Andrew was the threat source. Finally, Vulnerability and countermeasures. As we mentioned, assets can be degraded, compromised, or destroyed by a variety of threat methods. Because of this, we say that assets are vulnerable. To mitigate assets' vulnerabilities, we protect them with various countermeasures whose purpose it is to make assets less susceptible to one or more threat methods. Countermeasures are actions taken to negate or mitigate an adversary's ability to exploit vulnerabilities. A countermeasure can be a device, a procedure, or a technique that has the potential to make the asset less vulnerable to one or more threat methods or hazards. They do this by making a threat less likely to be successful, and they generally fall within three categories: preventative, corrective, and detective. Let's define. Some countermeasures tend to prevent the threat from ever happening. These are categorized as preventative. In an information system, an example of a preventative countermeasure could be a firewall, because it is designed to help prevent unauthorized users from ever getting into the system. Other countermeasures take effect after a threat event. These countermeasures either mitigate the effect that a threat has on the asset, or they allow you to quickly recover the asset's capability. These countermeasures are called corrective. To stay with our information system example, response plans and procedures are a corrective countermeasure because they help you respond after a threat event to minimize the impact. A non-IT example would be a sprinkler system. It puts out the fire, but it didn't stop it from happening. The third category of countermeasure makes a threat less successful merely by informing personnel of its presence. These are called detective countermeasures. An audit log or intrusion detection system would be an example of a detective countermeasure. It doesn't actually prevent threat activity, it just lets you know it happened. Another example would be a fire alarm. It doesn't prevent a fire or correct one, but it lets you know that there is one. The presence of countermeasures mitigates vulnerability to a threat method through their preventative, corrective, or detective nature. And before we do a risk analysis, we need to aggregately look at all of the countermeasures that are in place in order to understand an asset's level of vulnerability to the threats against it. Determining risk. Ultimately, risk occurs when there is any scenario in which there is a combination of three factors: an asset that has value, a threat method that can degrade the asset, and a level of vulnerability to the threat method. The most common representation of the risk resulting from such a scenario is the product obtained by multiplying these three factors. In other words, risk equals asset multiplied by threat multiplied by vulnerability. In many risk analysis methodologies, this is done by having metrics, weights, or numbers behind each of the three components of risk. Metrics characterize the level of criticality of assets, the severity and frequency of the threats, and the level of vulnerability to the threats after considering all of the countermeasures put in place to protect it. However, metrics are something to discuss another time. For now, just understand that risk is a combination of the criticality of the assets which support your mission, the threat sources and the methods they use to impact your assets, and the level to which your assets are vulnerable to threat methods based on the countermeasures in place to protect them. Thank you.